In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates that surpass even death in their cruelty. While the faithful servants of the Imperium speak of dying gloriously for the Emperor, of making the ultimate sacrifice on distant battlefields beneath alien suns, they rarely speak of what happens to those who do not die. They do not speak of the prisoners. They do not speak of the slaves. And most terrifying of all, they do not speak of those who fall into the hands of the Orks, those savage green-skinned Xenos, whose empires span countless worlds and whose appetite for violence knows no bounds. To be enslaved by Orks is to enter a hell where every waking moment becomes a struggle for survival, where the laws of civilized society dissolve into brutal hierarchies enforced by whips and cudgels, where your value as a human being is measured only by how much labor can be extracted from your broken body before it finally gives out. It is to exist in a nightmare where your captors view you with less regard than they show their own livestock, where torture and death lurk around every corner, and where hope itself becomes just another memory of a life that seems impossibly distant. The Orks are one of the most successful species in the entire galaxy, outnumbering perhaps every other intelligent starfaring race, even humanity itself. They are creatures engineered for war by the ancient Old Ones during the War in Heaven, designed to be the ultimate soldiers. Their biology is a fusion of animal and fungus, making them incredibly resilient and nearly impossible to eradicate from any world they infest. Their psychology is utterly alien, dominated by an insatiable need for violence and combat. They reproduce through spores released throughout their lives, and especially at death, meaning that any world touched by Ork presence will be plagued by them for generations to come. But what makes the Orks truly terrifying is not just their combat prowess or their overwhelming numbers. It is the fact that they see the entire universe through the lens of violence. Every interaction, every relationship, every moment of their existence revolves around the concept of strength and domination. They live in a rigid hierarchy where the biggest and strongest Ork rules absolutely, and this worldview extends to how they treat those who fall into their power. To an Ork, you are not a person. You are not even really a slave in the traditional sense. You are a grot, their word for servant or lesser being, occupying the same social position as the small Gretchen who scurry around their settlements performing menial tasks. The tangible rewards Orks fight for in their endless wars are simple: loot and slaves. Anything not destroyed during battle is looted. Any opponent not slain in battle is made a slave. This is not a complex system of bondage with laws and regulations. This is raw, brutal domination enforced through casual violence and the ever-present threat of death. Labor camps are a common sight in Ork territory, filled with the broken remnants of conquered populations forced to toil endlessly in service to the Ork war machine. When possible, Orks will enslave the entire population of a world, transforming planets into vast prison camps where millions labor under the green-skinned Xenos' merciless oversight. The experience of being an Ork slave varies depending on which Ork clan captures you, which war boss claims ownership of your labor, and what role you are forced to fill in their society. Some slaves work in mines, extracting the raw materials that feed Ork industry. Others toil in fields and farms, growing food to sustain the massive appetites of their masters. Still others are forced to work in the crude factories and workshops where Ork technology is cobbled together, assembling weapons and ammunition for the next battle. And then there are those whose fate is darker still, kept in pens like livestock, bred for the sole purpose of providing food for their Ork masters. What follows is an examination of what it truly means to be enslaved by Orks. This is not a story of heroic resistance or dramatic escape, though we will touch on those elements. This is an unflinching look at the daily reality of Ork slavery, at the physical torment and psychological horror that defines every moment of existence under their brutal rule. It is a journey through one of the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where the words on imperial recruitment posters about glorious service are revealed as comforting lies in the face of a truth far more terrible. For those who fall into Ork captivity, there is no glory, there is no honor, there is only survival, measured in hours and days rather than weeks or months, and the gnawing knowledge that death, when it finally comes, will likely be a mercy. The capture. How humans become Ork slaves. The moment your world falls to the Orks, your life as you knew it ends. The transition from free, imperial citizen to Ork slave can happen with shocking speed, often in the span of a single day or even hours. Understanding how this process unfolds is crucial to grasping the full horror of what awaits those who survive the initial Ork assault. Ork invasions follow a pattern, though the specifics vary depending on the size of the attacking force and the nature of the target world. When a WH40K arrives in a system, it announces itself with overwhelming violence. Ork attack craft pour from crude spacecraft and space hulks, their numbers so vast that they can darken the skies of entire continents. The initial assault is characterized by an orgy of destruction as the Orks indulge their primary instinct, the pure joy of combat. During these first hours and days of invasion, survival is largely a matter of chance. The Orks are not discriminating in their violence. They kill with gleeful abandon, cutting down anyone who stands before them simply because they enjoy the act of killing. Soldiers, civilians, the young, the old, none of these distinctions matter to the greenskins in the heat of battle. Their crude weapons, massive compared to human firearms, tear through flesh and bone with horrifying efficiency. Their physical strength allows them to literally rip humans apart with their bare hands when ammunition runs low or when the mood strikes them. But not everyone dies in the initial assault. As the battle progresses and organized resistance crumbles, the nature of Ork behavior begins to shift. Once the immediate thrill of combat starts to wane, the Orks remember the other reward of war: slaves. Those who surrender, those who flee but are captured, those who hide but are discovered, all become potential additions to the Ork workforce. The Second War for Armageddon provides a stark example of this process. When the Ork warlord, Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka's forces overwhelmed the defenses of Hive Infernus, the demoralized officer in charge shamefully surrendered the entire Hive city without a fight. Refugee columns formed, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the desert wastelands of Armageddon. These desperate people, fleeing the green tide, were systematically herded by Ork speed freak biker units, who circled them like predators stalking wounded prey. The bikers did not simply kill the refugees. Instead, they drove them back toward Hive Infernus, back toward their new masters, where they would be put to work as slaves in the Ork war machine. This herding process is typical of how Orks handle large numbers of potential slaves. They lack the organizational skills to conduct orderly prisoner processing, but they understand the basic concept of driving groups of humans toward designated areas. Speed freaks on bikes and buggies, Ork boys on foot with crude weapons. Even trained squigs and other creatures may be used to corral fleeing populations. Those who try to break away from the group are often killed as examples, their deaths serving to keep the others compliant through sheer terror. The actual moment of capture is often arbitrary and chaotic. You might be grabbed by a massive Ork hand as you try to flee through rubble-strewn streets. You might find yourself surrounded by Gretchen armed with scavenged weapons, their high-pitched voices shrieking orders as they force you to join other captives. You might simply be in the wrong place when an Ork run-third sweeps through an area, rounding up anyone still alive to fill out their slave gangs. Physical violence during capture is almost universal. Orks communicate through brutality, and they establish dominance over their new slaves through immediate and overwhelming force. Beatings are common, both to subdue resistance and simply because the Orks find it amusing. Bones may be broken, teeth may be knocked out. The message is always clear: you are powerless, You are property, and your survival depends entirely on your captor's whims. The journey to the labor camps or slave pens can be as harrowing as the capture itself. Ork logistics are crude at best, and slaves are often force-marched for days or even weeks to reach their final destinations. Those who fall from exhaustion or injury are typically killed on the spot, their bodies left to rot where they fall. Food and water are provided irregularly, if at all. The Orks seem to operate on the assumption that weak slaves who cannot survive the march are not worth keeping anyway. During these marches, you begin to understand the true nature of your new reality. The Orks do not hide their cruelty or temper their behavior. You watch as they casually torture captives for entertainment, pulling people from the column to use as living targets for weapon testing or gladiatorial combat. You see them select prisoners at random to be eaten, sometimes cooking them over fires, sometimes simply tearing into them raw. The screams of the dying become a constant background noise, a soundtrack to your new existence. Some captures occur in different circumstances. Individual humans or small groups may be seized during Ork raiding parties on worlds not yet fully conquered. These raids are common as Ork forces spread out from their initial landing zones, sweeping through surrounding territories to gather resources and slaves. Being captured in a raid means you might be thrown into a crude vehicle or cage and transported immediately to Ork-held territory, often with minimal explanation of what is happening or what will be done with you. The psychological impact of capture cannot be overstated. In the span of hours, your entire existence is shattered. Everything you knew, everyone you cared about, all the structures and systems that gave your life meaning are torn away. You are stripped of your identity as an individual and reduced to a resource to be exploited. The Orks do not learn your name. They do not care about your skills or your history. You are simply another soft-skinned human, valuable only for the labor that can be extracted from you before you die. Perhaps most terrifying is the arbitrary nature of who is captured and who is killed. There is no logic to it, no pattern you can discern and use to increase your chances of survival. The Ork who kills your friend standing next to you might spare you for no reason you can understand. The same Ork might kill you tomorrow for equally incomprehensible reasons. This randomness is psychologically devastating, stripping away any sense of control or agency you might cling to. For some, particularly those from worlds with strong imperial faith, capture by Xenos is seen as a fate worse than death. The thought of serving aliens, of being forced to aid the enemies of humanity, conflicts with everything the imperial creed teaches. Some choose to fight to the death rather than accept capture. Others attempt suicide when the opportunity presents itself. But most, driven by the fundamental human will to survive, accept their new status as slaves and hope desperately that rescue might someday come. That hope, as we shall see, is almost always in vain. Once you enter Ork captivity, escape becomes nearly impossible, and rescue by Imperial forces is extremely unlikely. The Imperium does not negotiate for prisoners. It does not launch rescue missions for enslaved civilians. The resources required to save you would be considered better spent on other military operations. In the cold calculus of Imperial strategy, you are already dead, your loss already accounted for in casualty reports filed by officials who never knew your name. The slave hierarchy and your place in it. Understanding your position in Ork society is essential to survival as a slave. The Orks operate under a brutally simple hierarchy based entirely on size and strength, and this same principle extends to how they view and treat their slaves. However, the reality is more nuanced than it might initially appear, with various categories of slaves experiencing different treatment and having different chances of survival. At the very bottom of Ork society are the snotlings, infantile orkoid creatures with limited intelligence used primarily for fungus tending. Just above them are the Gretchen, also called grots or runts. who are smaller, weaker Orkoid subspecies that serve as the primary slave labor force within Ork settlements. Gretchen perform all the menial tasks that Orks consider beneath them, from food preparation to message delivery to general organization and maintenance work. Human slaves occupy the same social position as Gretchen. The Ork word for servant or slave is grot, and this term is applied equally to Gretchen and to non-Orkoid slaves like humans. This linguistic detail reveals an important truth. To the Orks, there is no meaningful distinction between a Gretchen slave and a human slave. Both are weak, soft creatures to be bullied, exploited, and discarded when no longer useful. However, even within this lowest tier of Ork society, there exists an informal hierarchy based on perceived usefulness. Not all slaves are treated equally, and understanding these distinctions can mean the difference between a relatively tolerable existence and a short, brutal death. The most fortunate slaves, if such a term can be applied to any aspect of Ork captivity, are those with valuable skills that Orks cannot easily replicate. Technical expertise is particularly prized. While Ork mech boys possess an instinctive understanding of technology, they often lack the precision and patience required for certain types of work. Human slaves with engineering knowledge, the ability to operate complex machinery, or expertise in manufacturing processes may find themselves assigned to relatively stable positions in Ork workshops and factories. These skilled slaves can sometimes achieve a level of status that affords them marginally better treatment. Some even become trusted advisors to war bosses or mech boys, though this trust is always conditional and can evaporate in an instant if the Ork decides the slave is no longer useful or amusing. The freebooter known as Uzgul the Magnificent, for instance, has been known to keep technical experts from various species as permanent members of his crew, valuing their expertise in maintaining and operating captured technology. Language skills can also provide a small measure of protection. Humans who learn to speak the Ork language, or who can translate between different species, may be kept alive longer than others because they serve a useful function in communication. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick famously learned the Ork language from a captured raider in his youth, knowledge that would later prove crucial in understanding and fighting Ork invasions. Below the skilled slaves are the general laborers, the vast majority of human slaves in Ork territory. These are the men, women, and children forced to toil in mines, fields, factories, and construction sites. They have no special skills that set them apart, nothing that makes them individually valuable to their masters. They are interchangeable parts in the Ork industrial machine, worked until they can no longer perform their assigned tasks, then discarded like broken tools. General laborers are organized into work gangs, large groups supervised by runthards who ensure compliance through constant threats and occasional acts of violence. The size of these gangs can vary dramatically, from a few dozen slaves to thousands, depending on the scale of the project and the size of the Ork settlement. You might find yourself working alongside people from a dozen different worlds, all thrown together by the random chance of capture. Within work gangs, informal hierarchies often develop among the slaves themselves. Those who have survived longer may have learned tricks for avoiding the worst treatment or for securing slightly better working conditions. They might share this knowledge with newcomers, or they might hoard it jealously, viewing every other slave as competition for the limited safer positions. Trust between slaves is difficult to establish when the Orks deliberately foster an environment of constant fear and competition. At the very bottom of the slave hierarchy are those kept as livestock. These unfortunate souls are not workers at all, but food sources. When an Ork civilization grows to sufficient size and complexity while maintaining adequate resources, they may begin breeding imprisoned populations of humans for the sole purpose of being used as food. These human livestock are kept in complete darkness, in communal pens where they can barely move. The only time they see light is when water or food is brought to their enclosures. The conditions in the breeding pens are beyond description. The humans kept there are often modified by orc painboys, altered until they are barely recognizable as human. During the War of the Beast, in the 32nd Millennium, Imperial forces discovered that orcs on the planet Prax had been feeding captured humans steroids and farming them like cattle. The lucky ones had their teeth punched out, were shaved and branded, and then pushed into battle as auxiliary cannon fodder. Those not deemed fit for even this grim purpose were kept as breeding stock, their humanity slowly eroded by genetic manipulation until they were born as insensate, cowering creatures existing solely to be eaten. Understanding your place in this hierarchy is crucial because it helps you navigate the daily realities of slave life. If you possess skills that might be valuable to the orcs, demonstrating them quickly could move you from general labor to a slightly more secure position. If you are assigned to a work gang, learning to read the moods of your run-third overseer and understanding the informal power dynamics among fellow slaves might help you avoid the worst punishments. But there is no safety anywhere in this hierarchy. Even the most valued technical expert can be killed on a whim if an orc finds their work unsatisfactory or simply grows bored with them. The distinction between skilled slave and livestock is not a permanent one. Injuries, age, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time can see you demoted to more dangerous work or thrown into the breeding pens without warning. The orcs do not have formal slave markets or organized systems for buying and selling captives. Slaves within the grot slave class do not tend to have any particular owner. Instead, any orc can force any slave into work through cudgels and whips. There are usually no chains or fences keeping slaves confined. The orcs rely on the simple fact that there is nowhere for slaves to run, no escape from orc-held territory that would not result in death from the hostile environment, from feral orcs in the wilderness, or from recapture followed by brutal punishment. This lack of formal ownership creates an environment of constant uncertainty. You might spend weeks working for one orc gang, only to be grabbed by a different group and forced to perform entirely different labor. You have no rights, no way to appeal decisions, no recourse when treated unjustly. You are property that any orc can claim and use as they see fit. Daily life, labor, brutality, and survival. The daily existence of an orc slave is defined by three constants: exhausting labor, casual violence, and the desperate struggle to survive one more day. There are no rest days, no moments of reprieve, no recognition of your need for sleep or sustenance beyond the bare minimum required to keep you functioning. Every waking moment is consumed by work, and sleep, when it comes, offers only brief escape from the nightmare of your reality. Your day typically begins before dawn, if you can even track the passage of time in your current circumstances. In outdoor labor camps, the first light of the sun triggers frantic activity as runthers move through slave pens, using their grot prods and whips to drive workers out toward their assigned tasks. Those who move too slowly feel the electric shock of the grot prod or the sting of the whip across their backs. There is no gentle wake-up, no time to prepare yourself mentally for the day ahead. You wake in pain and move immediately to avoid more pain. The morning meal, if you can call it that, is meager and irregular. Orcs do not understand or care about proper nutrition for their slaves. Food is whatever they happen to have available, often spoiled or contaminated. You might receive a watery gruel made from fungus, a piece of hard bread that tastes like cardboard, or scraps from the orc's own meals. Water is similarly unpredictable, sometimes available in sufficient quantities, other times dangerously scarce. The quality is rarely good, often contaminated with various substances that cause illness among the slave population. Competition for food can be fierce. The Kazi orcs typically dump food into communal areas and let the slaves fight over it. The strong take what they want, while the weak go hungry. This deliberate creation of scarcity serves multiple purposes for the orcs. It reduces the amount of food they need to provide. It keeps the slaves weak and divided, and it provides entertainment as they watch the humans desperately scramble for sustenance. Once work begins, it continues without pause until the Orks decide the day is done. There are no scheduled breaks, no lunch hours, no consideration for exhaustion or injury. You work until you are told to stop, and if you slow down or attempt to rest without permission, punishment comes swiftly. The grot prod delivers shocks that make your muscles spasm uncontrollably. The whip leaves bleeding welts across your back. Physical beatings from runthod grabber sticks, long poles with mechanical pincers at the end, can leave you with broken bones or severe bruising that makes movement agonizing. The nature of your labor depends on where you have been assigned. In the mines, you might spend 12 or 15 hours bent double in cramped tunnels, digging for ores and minerals with tools that are poorly maintained and dangerous to use. The air is thick with dust that coats your lungs and makes every breath a struggle. Cave-ins are common, burying workers alive while the Orks above simply find replacements to continue the work. In the fields, you toil under whatever sun or stars hang in the alien sky above you, planting and harvesting the crops that feed the Ork hordes. Your back aches from constant bending. Your hands bleed from handling rough plants and crude tools. Depending on the world's climate, you might work in scorching heat that causes dehydration and heat stroke, or in freezing cold that leaves you shivering and numb. Factory work presents its own dangers. The machinery used in Ork workshops is crude and poorly maintained, lacking even basic safety features. Accidents are commonplace. Workers lose fingers, hands, even entire limbs to the grinding gears and cutting blades. The Orks view these incidents as the workers' fault and show no mercy to the injured. If you cannot work, you are worthless, and worthless slaves do not live long. The ammunition factories are particularly nightmarish. You might spend your days filling shells with explosive compounds, never knowing if the next batch will detonate and vaporize you and everyone around you. The chemicals used in propellants and explosives cause long-term health problems, burning your lungs and skin, causing tremors and weakness that only worsen with continued exposure. The Orks do not provide protective equipment. They do not care if you die from chemical exposure, because there are always more slaves to replace you. Throughout the workday, the threat of violence hangs over every moment. Runthards patrol the work sites constantly, their squig hounds snapping at anyone who appears to be slacking. These creatures are trained to consume slaves who try to escape or who fail to meet the Runthards' expectations. Watching a squig hound tear into a fellow slave while the Runthard laughs is a common occurrence, a reminder of what awaits those who cannot keep up the pace. But it is not just the Runthards you must fear. Regular Ork boys often wander through work areas, and their presence is always dangerous. An Ork might decide to use a slave for target practice, testing the accuracy of their crude firearms on living targets. They might grab a slave to use as a demonstration subject for a new weapon they have acquired, curious to see what damage it can inflict. They might simply be in a bad mood and take it out on whatever slave happens to be nearby. The casual nature of this violence is perhaps its most horrifying aspect. To the Orks, killing a slave means nothing. It is not a significant decision that requires justification. It is as casual as swatting an insect or kicking a rock out of your path. You might work beside someone for weeks, only to see them crushed by an Ork's power fist because the greenskin found their face annoying. The randomness makes it impossible to feel safe, impossible to relax even for a moment. Physical exhaustion accumulates relentlessly. You are never given adequate time to recover from one day's labor before the next begins. Your muscles develop a constant ache that never quite goes away. Your body begins to break down from the sustained strain. Old injuries do not heal properly because you are never allowed sufficient rest. New injuries pile on top of the old ones, creating a cascade of damage that slowly destroys your ability to function. Medical care is essentially non-existent for slaves. If you are injured but can still work, you will be forced to continue working despite the pain. If you are injured so severely that you cannot work, you will likely be killed and replaced. The concept of healing a slave back to health does not occur. To the Orks, or if it does, they dismiss it as inefficient. It is easier to work you to death and capture new slaves than to invest time and resources in maintaining your health. Disease spreads rapidly through slave populations. The crowded, unsanitary conditions in slave pens create perfect breeding grounds for illness. The Orks' complete disregard for hygiene means that contamination is constant. You might be forced to work in areas covered with toxic waste, or to sleep in pens where waste accumulates because the Orks never thought to provide sanitation facilities. When disease breaks out, it can devastate entire work gangs, but the Orks simply wait for it to run its course, then replace the dead with fresh captives. The psychological toll of daily life as an Ork slave rivals the physical hardships. Every day requires you to witness horrible things. You watch fellow slaves die from exhaustion, from accidents, from random violence. You hear their screams as they are tortured or eaten. You see children worked to death, the elderly beaten for being too slow, the sick left to die in filth. The accumulation of these traumas weighs on your mind, creating a kind of numbness born from sheer overload. Some slaves break mentally long before their bodies give out. They become hollow shells, moving through the motions of work without really being present. They have retreated into some inner space where the horrors of their reality cannot reach them. The Orks sometimes find these broken slaves amusing and keep them around as a form of entertainment, but more often they simply work them until they stop moving, then discard the body. Others cling desperately to their humanity, trying to maintain some sense of who they were before capture. They might whisper prayers to the Emperor during rare moments of privacy. They might help fellow slaves when they can, sharing food or easing someone's burden even at cost to themselves. These small acts of kindness become lifelines, proof that not everything good has been destroyed by Ork captivity. The end of the workday brings only marginal relief. You are herded back to the slave pens, usually without having eaten since morning. The pens themselves are crude enclosures, often nothing more than open areas surrounded by scrap metal walls or natural barriers. The Orks do not provide shelter, bedding, or any amenities whatsoever. You sleep on bare ground, pressed against other slaves for warmth if the climate is cold, suffering from heat if it is not. Night offers no safety from Ork violence. Patrols continue throughout the darkness, and Runthards may decide to conduct random inspections or punishments. Some Orks view the slave pens as entertainment, wandering through to terrorize the inhabitants, or select victims for various forms of abuse. The screams that echo through the night make sleep difficult, even when exhaustion should make it inevitable. The overseers, Runthards, and their methods of control, the Faun. Runthards, also known as slavers, are the Orks who directly oversee and manage slave populations, and understanding them is crucial to understanding the daily reality of Ork slavery. These specialized Orks possess an unusual trait for their species: patience. Where most Orks would rather be fighting and killing, Runthards have the temperament to take care of the menial details of slave management, breeding, and organization. Despite what their role might suggest, Runthards are not kind or gentle masters. They are Orks, which means they are fundamentally cruel, violent, and driven by the need to dominate those weaker than themselves. What sets them apart is not compassion, but rather a calculated approach to brutality. They understand that keeping slaves productive requires a balance between inflicting enough pain to ensure obedience and not causing so much damage that workers become useless. The tools of the Runthard trade are designed specifically for slave control. The most basic is the whip, a simple but effective implement that can deliver painful strikes without necessarily causing permanent injury. Runthards carry whips at all times and use them liberally to direct slave gangs, punish perceived laziness, or simply to remind slaves of their place in the hierarchy. The crack of a Runthard's whip becomes one of the most familiar sounds in a slave's daily existence. More sophisticated is the grabber stick, a long pole outfitted with a pulley-operated Moor-like pincer. This mechanical device can be used in several ways. The Runtherd might use it to grab and restrain a slave who is trying to flee or resist, clamping the pincer around their neck or limbs to control their movement. Skilled Runtherds can grab a fleeing Gretchen or human slave and hurl them into danger with one smooth motion, perhaps throwing them into a minefield to clear a path or tossing them toward enemy lines to serve as a distraction during combat. The grabber stick can also be used to throttle slaves who prove too resistant to control. The mechanical pincer tightens around the throat, cutting off air until the victim loses consciousness or dies. The casualness with which Runtherds employ this method is chilling. A slave who has been grabbed by a stick knows they are seconds away from death and will typically cease all resistance immediately. Perhaps the most feared tool in a Runtherd's arsenal is the grot prod, an orc imitation of human electrical cattle prods, but much larger and more powerful. These weapons, created by mech boys and employed by progressive Runtherds, can be used to motivate, incapacitate, or even kill, depending on the voltage setting. The tech-savvy Runtherds who favor these weapons have learned to use them with disturbing precision, delivering shocks to specific parts of the body to achieve different effects. A low-voltage shock from a grot prod causes intense pain, but no lasting damage, perfect for encouraging a slow worker to move faster or punishing a minor infraction. Medium voltage can cause muscle spasms that leave the victim temporarily unable to move, useful for subduing slaves without killing them. High voltage can stop a heart or cause severe neurological damage, effectively executing the target while maintaining the illusion that it might have been an accident rather than deliberate murder. The grot prod delivers its shock through direct contact. The Runtherd must touch the prod to the slave's body, usually targeting areas where the pain will be most intense: the neck, spine, kidneys, or genitals. The arbitrary nature of when and why these shocks are delivered creates an environment of constant fear. You never know when you might feel that horrible jolt of electricity coursing through your body. Never know if this time the Runtherd has set the voltage high enough to kill. Runtherds also employ living weapons in the form of squighounds. These creatures are a variety of squig, the symbiotic organisms that form part of the orkoid ecosystem, specifically bred and trained to herd and intimidate slaves. Squighounds are voracious predators with powerful jaws full of razor-sharp teeth. They are kept perpetually hungry, making them aggressive and eager to attack any target designated by their Runtherd master. The primary function of squighounds is to eat errant or fleeing slaves. When a slave attempts to escape from a work gang or tries to hide during a labor assignment, the Runtherd releases the squighounds to hunt them down. The creatures are remarkably effective at tracking human scent, and once they catch their prey, the results are gruesome. The squighound literally devours the escapee alive, often while other slaves are forced to watch. This practice serves a dual purpose. It eliminates the problem of the fleeing slave, while simultaneously terrorizing the remaining workers into obedience. The Runtherds call this increasing morale, though what they actually mean is increasing compliance through fear. Watching a fellow slave torn apart by gnashing teeth while screaming in agony is an incredibly effective deterrent against attempting escape. The personality of individual Runtherds can vary, but certain traits are nearly universal. All Runtherds take pride in their work, viewing themselves as craftsmen who shape and manage their slave herds. They often compete with other Runtherds to breed the fiercest grots and the most productive slave gangs, seeing this as a measure of their skill and status. Some Runtherds become known across multiple orc settlements for their particularly effective or cruel management techniques. The role of Runtherd is hereditary in orc society. They believe themselves descended from families that were cast from the clans in the distant past, though whether this origin story is accurate or simply orc mythology is unclear. This hereditary aspect means that Runtherd practices and techniques are passed down through generations, creating lineages of slave management expertise. Besides breeding and managing lower greenskins and captured slaves, Runthurds also act as the storytellers and keepers of oral history in Orc society. They remember the great battles and famous war bosses of the past, preserving these stories and sharing them during gatherings. This dual role as both slave driver and historian gives Runthurds a position of respect within Orc settlements that goes beyond their immediate function. For human slaves, learning to read a Runthurd's moods and behaviors becomes essential to survival. Each Runthurd has their own quirks and preferences, their own triggers that provoke violence or leniency. Some are relatively consistent in their brutality, making them predictable if not safe. Others are wildly unpredictable, dispensing punishment randomly in ways that make it impossible to avoid their wrath. Some slaves attempt to make themselves useful to their Runthurd overseer, hoping that demonstrating value will provide a measure of protection. This strategy sometimes works, particularly if you possess skills the Runthurd finds genuinely useful. A slave who can maintain the Runthurd's equipment, who can organize work gangs efficiently, or who can communicate the Runthurd's orders to other slaves, might earn a slightly elevated position within the slave hierarchy. However, this strategy carries significant risks. Becoming too visible to your Runthurd means attracting their attention, and Orc attention is always dangerous. A Runthurd might decide that a useful slave would be even more entertaining as a target for their latest weapon test. They might grow jealous of a slave who seems too competent, viewing them as a potential threat to their authority. Or they might simply grow bored with you and decide to kill you for amusement, regardless of your usefulness. The relationship between Runthurds and their charges is not one of owner and property in the traditional sense. As mentioned earlier, slaves in Orc society do not have specific owners. Instead, Runthurds manage territories or work projects, and any slaves within their domain fall under their authority. Multiple Runthurds might operate within the same settlement, each responsible for different aspects of slave labor or different work gangs. This system creates a strange dynamic where slaves might interact with multiple Runthurds during any given day. The Runthurd who drives you to the mines in the morning might be different from the one who oversees your work there, and both might be different from the one who herds you back to the slave pens at night. Each transition between Runthurds represents a moment of uncertainty, a brief period where you must quickly assess the new overseer's mood and adjust your behavior accordingly. The Runthurd's most powerful weapon, beyond all their physical implements of torture and control, is the atmosphere of fear they cultivate. They are unpredictable in their violence, sometimes letting infractions slide, while brutally punishing actions that seem innocent. This inconsistency is not accidental. It serves to keep slaves in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing what might provoke punishment, always second-guessing every action and decision. Types of labor and work assignments. The variety of work assigned to Orc slaves is vast, spanning everything from the most brutal physical labor to specialized technical tasks. Understanding the different types of work and their relative dangers is important for grasping the full scope of the slave experience in Orc territory. Mining operations represent some of the most dangerous and physically demanding work. Orc mines are crude affairs, dug with minimal concern for stability or worker safety. The Orcs extract whatever minerals and ores their mech boys need for construction and manufacturing, and they do so with the same reckless disregard for consequences that characterizes all their endeavors. As a mining slave, you might be sent deep, underground with only the crudest tools, pickaxes, shovels, perhaps a primitive drill. The tunnels are often poorly supported, prone to collapse at any moment. Rockfalls kill dozens or hundreds of workers regularly, burying them alive beneath tons of stone and earth. The Orcs simply dig new tunnels around the collapsed sections, leaving the bodies where they fell. The air quality in Orc mines is abysmal. Ventilation is minimal or non-existent, leaving the atmosphere thick with dust and various toxic gases. You breathe in particles that coat your lungs, causing progressive respiratory damage that makes each day harder than the last. Some mines contain naturally occurring toxic minerals that poison workers slowly, causing symptoms like tremors, loss of coordination, and eventually organ failure. Lighting in the mines comes from crude torches or bioluminescent fungus, creating pools of dim illumination separated by vast stretches of darkness. Working in these conditions means you can barely see what you are doing, increasing the risk of accidents and injuries. The darkness also allows for rats, insects, and other creatures to proliferate in the mines, some of them dangerous predators that view weak or isolated workers as prey. Agricultural work, while less immediately dangerous than mining, carries its own hardships. Entire native populations are forced into agricultural labor to manufacture food for the orc hordes. The work is backbreaking and endless, following the cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting with no rest periods between. The crops grown for orc consumption are often varieties of fungus native to the orcoid ecosystem, plants that thrive in conditions that would kill human edible species. Working with these crops exposes you to spores and toxins that cause skin irritation, allergic reactions, and respiratory problems. Some orc crop varieties are aggressive and dangerous in their own right, with thorns, acidic sap, or defensive mechanisms that cause injury to anyone handling them. The tools provided for agricultural work are crude and poorly maintained. You might spend entire days bent over hand tools with broken or missing handles, using your bare hands to pull weeds or harvest crops because no implements are available. The physical toll of this constant bending and stooping causes chronic back problems that leave you in agony by the end of each day. Factory work encompasses a wide range of activities, all of them dangerous. Some slaves work in munitions plants, filling shells with explosive compounds or assembling the components of orc weapons. The crude nature of orc manufacturing means that accidents are commonplace. Explosions regularly kill entire work crews, and the orcs respond by simply sending in new slaves to continue the work around the charred remains of their predecessors. Other factory slaves work on assembly lines, putting together the various components of orc technology. You might spend 12 hours a day inserting bolts into the same piece of machinery over and over again. Your hands developing calluses and repetitive stress injuries from the monotonous motion. The machinery around you operates without safety guards or emergency stops, and workers who get caught in the gears are simply pulled into the mechanism and crushed, their blood and tissue becoming part of the industrial waste. Chemical work is particularly nightmarish. Some slaves are assigned to work in facilities where propellants, explosives, and other dangerous compounds are manufactured. The exposure to these chemicals causes immediate burns and long-term health problems. Your skin develops rashes and lesions. Your lungs burn with every breath. Your vision deteriorates as the fumes damage your eyes. There is no protective equipment, no ventilation systems, nothing to mitigate the constant exposure to substances that are slowly killing you. Construction work sees slaves building or expanding orc settlements. This might involve hauling massive stones, assembling crude fortifications, or constructing the ramshackle buildings that orcs use for shelter and storage. The work is physically exhausting, requiring you to lift and move objects far heavier than what a healthy human should safely handle. Injuries are constant: crushed fingers, broken bones, hernias from excessive strain. Some slaves are assigned to maintaining orc vehicles and war machines. This can actually be one of the relatively less dangerous assignments, as the orcs need their vehicles functional and may therefore provide slightly better conditions for the mechanics and technicians. However, orc technology is inherently unstable and prone to catastrophic failures. Working on a vehicle that might explode, catch fire, or simply collapse on top of you creates constant stress and frequent casualties. Ammunition manufacturing deserves special attention due to its particularly high fatality rate. Slaves in ammunition plants work with volatile explosives all day, every day. You might be filling shells with unstable compounds, assembling fuses that could detonate at any moment, or packing gunpowder into casings that leak and create explosive dust throughout the facility. One spark, one moment of static electricity, one defective component, and the entire facility can detonate. killing everyone inside. The Orks find this risk acceptable because ammunition is essential to their war machine, and they can always capture more slaves to replace those killed in explosions. From the slave's perspective, working in munitions is essentially a slow-motion death sentence. It is not a question of whether you will die in an explosion, but rather when and how many others will die with you. Waste management, such as it exists in Ork settlements, is another assignment that slaves might receive. This involves dealing with the enormous amounts of garbage and refuse that Ork society produces. You might spend your days sorting through toxic waste, trying to identify anything that can be recycled or reused while exposed to all manner of hazardous materials. The smell alone is overwhelming, and the health effects of constant exposure to rotting organic matter and chemical waste are devastating. Some slaves are assigned as personal servants to individual Orks, particularly nobs or important mech boys. This role can range from marginally better to catastrophically worse than general labor, depending entirely on the temperament of the Ork you serve. A slave serving a nob might have access to better food and shelter, but they are also constantly in close proximity to an Ork who could kill them casually at any moment. The arbitrary nature of Ork violence means that personal servants often have shorter lifespans than general laborers, despite their seemingly elevated status. The constant threat of death. In Ork captivity, death is not a distant possibility that might someday occur. It is a constant companion, present in every moment of every day, manifesting in countless forms, both sudden and gradual. Understanding the many ways you might die as an Ork slave is essential to grasping the full horror of your situation. The most common cause of death is simple exhaustion and overwork. The Orks push their slaves to the absolute limits of physical endurance and beyond. You are worked for 12, 15, sometimes 20 hours a day without adequate food, water, or rest. Your body accumulates damage faster than it can repair itself. Eventually, something critical fails. Your heart gives out from the strain, or your body can no longer maintain basic functions, and you simply collapse. When slaves die from overwork, the Orks rarely even notice immediately. You might fall where you were working, your body left there until someone trips over it, or until the smell becomes noticeable. Then the corpse is dragged away and dumped in whatever area serves as the settlement's mass grave or feeding ground for scavengers. The work continues without pause, your former position in the labor gang filled by the next available slave. Industrial accidents claim vast numbers of slaves. The crude and poorly maintained machinery used throughout Ork settlements is inherently dangerous. Safety features are non-existent. Warning systems are absent. Emergency stops do not exist or do not function. When something goes wrong, workers are simply caught in the machinery and destroyed. You might be feeding materials into a processing machine when your sleeve gets caught on a moving part, pulling you in before you can react. The machine grinds on, crushing and mangling your body while you scream, until you stop moving and become just another piece of debris that needs to be cleared away. Your fellow slaves continue working around your remains, unable to help, knowing they might be next. Explosions are another frequent killer, particularly in ammunition plants and certain types of factories. The volatile materials being handled, combined with poor quality control and crude manufacturing processes, create conditions where catastrophic failures are almost inevitable. A batch of propellant might detonate, vaporizing everyone within the blast radius. A fuel storage tank might rupture and ignite, creating a fireball that consumes entire buildings full of workers. These explosions can kill dozens or hundreds at once, but the Orks view them as acceptable losses. The ammunition needs to be manufactured, the work must continue, and there are always more slaves to replace those killed. You might work in a munitions plant, knowing that similar facilities have exploded multiple times before, knowing that the same fate almost certainly awaits you, yet having no choice but to continue your assigned tasks. Disease and infection kill more slaves than most people would suspect. The unsanitary conditions, lack of medical care, and constant exposure to toxins and contaminants create perfect conditions for illness to spread. A simple cut that becomes infected can become a death sentence when there is no treatment available. Dysentery from contaminated water or food kills slowly and painfully, leaving you weak and dehydrated as you continue to be forced to work. Epidemics can sweep through slave populations with devastating speed. Crowded pens where hundreds of slaves are pressed together in filth, sharing the same contaminated water and breathing the same disease-filled air, allow illnesses to spread rapidly. The Orks do not quarantine sick slaves or attempt to stop disease transmission. They simply let the epidemic run its course, then replace the dead with fresh captives. Starvation is a slower but equally certain killer. The Orks provide minimal food to their slaves, just enough to keep most of them functional for a while. But most is not all, and there are always slaves who receive less than even this meager ration. Competition for food means some slaves are simply outcompeted by stronger individuals and slowly starve to death over weeks or months. The physical effects of prolonged starvation are horrible. Your body consumes its own tissues for energy, breaking down muscle and organ tissue to keep your brain and heart functioning. You become skeletal, your skin stretched tight over bones, your eyes sunken into your skull. Even basic tasks become monumentally difficult as your strength fails. Eventually, your body can no longer sustain itself, and you die, often while still being forced to work right up until the moment your heart stops. Exposure to the elements kills many slaves, particularly those working in outdoor assignments on worlds with harsh climates. If you are working on a frozen world, the cold saps your strength and causes frostbite that destroys fingers, toes, and other extremities. Hypothermia sets in when you are no longer able to maintain your core temperature, causing confusion, loss of coordination, and finally death as your body systems shut down. On hot worlds, heatstroke and dehydration are constant threats. The Orks do not provide adequate water or shade. You work under the blazing sun hour after hour, your body's cooling mechanisms overwhelmed by the temperature. When heatstroke occurs, your brain essentially begins to cook inside your skull, causing hallucinations, seizures, and eventual death. Random Ork violence is perhaps the most psychologically devastating cause of death because of its complete arbitrariness. An Ork might kill you because they are testing a new weapon and want to see what it does to a human body. They might kill you because you looked at them wrong, or because they are in a bad mood, or because they find your suffering entertaining. They might kill you for no reason at all, simply grabbing you as you walk past and crushing your skull with their bare hands before moving on to whatever they were doing. This randomness means there is no way to protect yourself through good behavior or careful attention to Ork moods. You can do everything right, work hard, avoid attention, stay out of trouble, and still die simply because an Ork wandering past decided to kill someone and you happen to be nearby. This knowledge creates a state of constant grinding anxiety that wears down your psychological defenses. Being eaten is a fate that awaits many slaves. Orks regularly torture and eat humans, sometimes cooking them beforehand, sometimes simply consuming them raw. This can range from an Ork picking one slave to eat when they feel hungry, to industrial-scale food production, where entire facilities are dedicated to processing human flesh as food. The process of being selected for consumption is terrifying. The Orks might simply grab whoever is nearest, or they might make a game of it, having slaves fight each other with the loser being eaten. Sometimes they cook their victims slowly over fires while they are still alive, finding the screams entertaining. Other times they simply tear into living flesh with their teeth, the victim dying slowly from blood loss and trauma while being devoured. In some Ork settlements that have reached sufficient size and complexity, humans are bred specifically for consumption in what amounts to industrial livestock production. These breeding pens keep humans in complete darkness, in communal enclosures where they can barely move. The inhabitants are modified by orc pain boys until they are barely recognizable as human, born without teeth, hair, or nails, existing as insensate, cowering creatures whose only purpose is to be eaten. Gladiatorial combat claims slaves who are forced to fight each other or alien creatures for orc entertainment. The orcs enjoy watching fights, and they often create opportunities for such spectacles by throwing slaves into pits or arenas with weapons and forcing them to battle. The loser dies, obviously, but even the winner rarely survives long, as they will be forced to fight again and again until they eventually lose. Some slaves die attempting to escape. The desperation of their situation drives them to try fleeing despite the near impossibility of success. Squighounds hunt them down and tear them apart. Orc patrols catch them and kill them as examples to other slaves. Even if they somehow evade immediate capture, the hostile environment of most orc-held worlds makes long-term survival impossible without resources and support. Punishment executions serve as examples to other slaves and as entertainment for the orcs. Slaves who displease their masters might be killed in elaborate and painful ways, specifically designed to terrorize the remaining population. Public tortures, where slaves are slowly killed over hours or days, while other workers are forced to watch, create an atmosphere of fear that keeps the broader slave population compliant. Psychological torment and orc psychology. The physical hardships of orc slavery are matched and perhaps exceeded by the psychological torture inherent in every aspect of the experience. Understanding the mental and emotional toll of captivity requires understanding orc psychology and how profoundly alien it is from human thinking. Orcoid psychology is utterly different from that of humans, to the point where they can simultaneously believe two contradictory facts without experiencing any cognitive dissonance. This ability to hold conflicting ideas represents a fundamental difference in how orcs process information and understand reality. It makes them unpredictable and incomprehensible to human slaves trying to anticipate their behavior or find logical patterns in their actions. Orcs have no concept of love as humans understand it. They find human affection strange and inexplicable, viewing emotional bonds between people as a weakness to be exploited. What orcs do experience is a kind of battle bliss, an ecstatic state that occurs during combat. They associate this feeling with both love and hate, blurring the distinction between the two in ways that make no sense to human psychology. This absence of empathy or emotional connection means that orcs literally cannot understand why their treatment of slaves might be wrong. They do not recognize the suffering they inflict as suffering in any meaningful sense. To them, humans are weak creatures whose screams and pleas are merely noise, no more significant than the sounds made by malfunctioning machinery. Your pain means nothing to them because they are incapable of recognizing it as something that matters. The arbitrary nature of orc behavior creates constant psychological stress for slaves. There is no pattern to discern, no rules to learn that might help you avoid punishment or death. An orc might walk past you 100 times without incident, then crush your head on the 101st time for no reason you can perceive. This randomness makes it impossible to develop coping mechanisms based on understanding and predicting your captor's behavior. Orc humor, such as it is, often involves the suffering of weaker beings. They find it entertaining when slaves are injured, when accidents occur, when torture produces particularly creative screams. To witness something horrible happening to a fellow slave and see your orc overseers laughing about it creates a profound sense of helplessness and despair. You are trapped in a nightmare run by creatures who view your torment as comedy. The linguistic and cultural barrier between humans and orcs adds another layer of psychological difficulty. Even if you learn some of the orc language, which few slaves manage, the fundamental differences in worldview make true communication nearly impossible. Orcs express themselves primarily through violence and displays of strength. Nuanced concepts like mercy, fairness, or justice do not exist in their vocabulary or their thinking. This inability to communicate or reason with your captors means there is no avenue for appeal, no way to advocate for better treatment or to negotiate for any improvement in your circumstances. You are completely at their mercy, and they have no mercy to give. Every interaction is dictated purely by their whims and their assessment of whether you are useful enough to keep alive at that particular moment. The loss of identity is one of the most devastating psychological effects of Ork slavery. The Orks do not learn your name. They do not care about your history, your skills, your relationships, anything that made you who you were before capture. You are reduced to a generic grot, interchangeable with every other slave, valuable only for the labor you can perform. This erasure of identity undermines your sense of self at a fundamental level. Without anyone acknowledging who you are or who you were, it becomes harder to maintain that sense of self internally. Some slaves cling desperately to memories of their former lives, rehearsing them mentally to keep them alive. Others find those memories too painful and try to suppress them, focusing only on immediate survival. Both strategies carry psychological costs. The constant witnessing of atrocity takes an accumulating toll. Every day brings fresh horrors: slaves killed in accidents, executed for minor infractions, tortured for entertainment, selected for consumption. You watch children worked to death, see the elderly beaten until their bones break, witness pregnant women forced to labor until they miscarry. The human mind is not designed to process this level of sustained trauma, and the psychological damage builds over time. Some slaves develop a kind of emotional numbness, a dissociative state where they function mechanically without really being present. They have retreated so far inside themselves that the external horror cannot reach them anymore. This psychological strategy allows them to continue functioning, but at the cost of losing connection to their own humanity. They become shells, moving through the motions of survival without really living. Others maintain their emotional connection to what is happening around them, feeling the full weight of every horror they witness. This keeps them more psychologically present and human, but the cost is enormous. The grief, rage, and despair that come from truly feeling the scope of what is being done to them and their fellow slaves can be overwhelming. Many slaves in this state eventually reach a breaking point where they simply give up, ceasing to care whether they live or die. The absence of hope is perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Ork slavery. There is no realistic prospect of rescue. The Imperium does not negotiate for prisoners or launch rescue missions for enslaved civilians. Your world has fallen, your people are scattered or dead, and the vast machinery of Imperial governance has already written you off as a loss. Even if Imperial forces eventually retake the territory where you are held, you will likely be long dead by then, or so broken that recovery is impossible. Escape is nearly impossible for reasons both practical and psychological. Even if you could somehow evade the Rundhards, the Squighounds, and the Ork patrols, where would you go? You are on an alien world or in Ork-held territory with no resources, no allies, no support systems. The hostile environment would likely kill you even if you managed to get away from the Orks themselves. And after weeks or months of slavery, your body is so damaged and weakened that you lack the physical capacity for the demands of escape and survival in the wilderness. The psychological impact of knowing that this is your life now, that there will be no dramatic rescue or escape, that you will likely die here as a slave, crushed or starved or worked to death, creates a despair so deep that it becomes difficult to articulate. Some slaves lose the will to survive, ceasing to eat even when food is available, provoking their overseers in hopes of being killed quickly rather than dying slowly from accumulated damage. Yet even in the depths of this despair, some slaves find small ways to maintain their humanity and sanity. They form bonds with fellow slaves, creating support networks based on shared suffering. They perform small acts of kindness when possible, sharing food or helping injured workers, even when doing so puts them at risk. They whisper prayers to the Emperor during rare moments of privacy, maintaining whatever faith they can in the face of evidence that suggests they have been abandoned by both the Imperium and the divine. These small acts of resistance and humanity become crucial to psychological survival. They are proof that the Orks have not completely destroyed everything good, that some portion of human dignity and compassion persists even in the worst circumstances imaginable. For some slaves, maintaining these connections and behaviors becomes their primary purpose, the thing that keeps them going when pure survival instinct might not be enough. The breeding pens and livestock status. Among all the horrors of Ork slavery, perhaps none is more fundamentally dehumanizing than the practice of keeping humans as livestock. When Ork civilizations grow to sufficient size and complexity while maintaining adequate resources, they sometimes begin breeding imprisoned populations of humans for the sole purpose of being used as food. Understanding this practice requires confronting one of the darkest aspects of Ork society and what it reveals about how they view other species. The breeding pens represent the ultimate degradation, a fate that strips away every last vestige of human dignity and reduces people to nothing more than meat to be harvested. Those consigned to these facilities experience conditions that go beyond mere slavery into territory that challenges the limits of human comprehension and endurance. The physical conditions in breeding pens are deliberately designed to maximize yield while minimizing the resources required to maintain the human livestock. Inhabitants are kept in complete darkness, a choice that serves multiple purposes. The absence of light reduces the amount of energy the humans need to maintain their circadian rhythms and visual processing systems. It also creates a state of sensory deprivation that pacifies the population, making them less likely to resist or cause problems. The pens themselves are communal enclosures where dozens or hundreds of humans are pressed together in spaces far too small for the population. There is no room to move freely, no privacy, no escape from the constant press of other bodies. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed flesh, human waste, and fear. The only time the inhabitants see light is when food or water is brought to their enclosures, brief moments of illumination that reveal the true horror of their surroundings before darkness returns. The modifications performed on breeding pen inhabitants by Ork painboys represent some of the most disturbing examples of Ork biotechnology. The goal is to create humans who are more efficient as food sources, less troublesome to manage, faster to mature, with more edible mass relative to their overall size. The methods used to achieve these goals are nightmarish. During the War of the Beast, in the 32nd Millennium, Imperial forces who liberated breeding facilities on the planet Prax discovered the extent of these modifications. The humans being kept as livestock had been altered until they were barely recognizable as human. They were born without teeth, hair, or nails, their development arrested at a stage where these features had not yet formed. Their minds had been similarly stunted, leaving them as insensate, cowering creatures incapable of complex thought or resistance. The modifications extend beyond mere appearance. The musculature and metabolism of breeding pen humans are altered to promote rapid weight gain and to convert nutrients into edible tissue more efficiently. Their digestive systems are simplified, allowing them to survive on the cheapest possible feed. Their nervous systems are sometimes dulled, reducing their capacity for suffering, or at least their ability to express it in ways that might disturb even Ork sensibilities. The breeding program itself is conducted with the same crude efficiency that characterizes all Ork endeavors. Humans are paired for reproduction based on whatever criteria the painboys and rundhards deem important, with no consideration for the individuals involved. Pregnancies are monitored only to the extent necessary to ensure live births. The newborns are immediately separated from their mothers and placed into the system of communal raising that will prepare them for their eventual slaughter. The psychological state of breeding pen inhabitants is difficult to assess because the modifications they have undergone have fundamentally altered their capacity for thought and feeling. The original generations, those captured, and placed into the pens with their full mental faculties intact, experience a descent into madness as they realize what is being done to them and what will be done to their children. The subsequent generations, born into darkness and modified before they can develop normally, may lack the cognitive capacity to understand their situation, which might be a mercy or might be the cruelest aspect of their fate. The feeding of breeding pen populations is done with the same minimal investment of resources that characterizes Ork slave management elsewhere. The food provided is whatever is cheapest and most readily available, often waste products from other aspects of Ork industry, or crops grown specifically as livestock feed. The nutritional content is sufficient to keep the inhabitants alive and growing, but no thought is given to their comfort or health beyond what is necessary to maintain them as viable food sources. Water is similarly provided at minimal levels. The communal nature of the shan pens means that contamination is constant, with water sources serving as vectors for disease transmission. Infections and illnesses spread rapidly through the population, but the Orks simply accept this as a normal aspect of livestock management, replacing the dead and sick with new stock. The eventual slaughter of breeding pen inhabitants is conducted with the same casual brutality that characterizes Ork behavior toward all slaves. Some are taken individually as needed, selected at random or based on size and weight. Others might be processed in larger numbers if the Ork population is preparing for a major campaign and needs to build up food stores. The methods of slaughter vary, but they rarely include any consideration for minimizing suffering or ensuring quick death. Not all humans kept as livestock are confined to breeding pens. Some Ork settlements practice a more dispersed form of human cattle ranching, where groups of humans are kept in outdoor enclosures or designated areas and raised under slightly less horrific conditions than the breeding pens. These humans might be used for different purposes, some for meat, some for leather, and other products derived from human tissue, some for experimental subjects in painboy surgeries. The fortunate individuals in these more traditional livestock arrangements still face a grim existence, but they at least maintain some connection to sensory experience and the outside world. They can see the sky, feel the weather, interact with other humans in ways that allow for the development of relationships and social structures. Their eventual fate remains the same as those in the breeding pens, but the journey to that fate is marginally less horrific. During the War of the Beast, some humans kept as livestock were given a different purpose. After being fed steroids and other substances to increase their muscle mass, they had their teeth punched out, were shaved, branded, and then pushed into battle as auxiliary cannon, fodder. This represents a variation on the livestock theme, where the meat is used for a different purpose before slaughter, sent to fight and die in Ork battles rather than simply being processed for consumption. The existence of breeding pens and human livestock operations reveals important truths about Ork psychology and society. It demonstrates their complete lack of empathy or moral consideration for other species. Humans are not enemies to be fought honorably, not even slaves to be worked until exhaustion. They are resources to be exploited, no different from the fungus the snotlings cultivate, or the squigs the Orks raise for various purposes. Resistance, escape, and their consequences. In the face of overwhelming oppression and seemingly impossible odds, some slaves attempt to resist their Ork masters or escape from captivity. Understanding these efforts and their almost universal failure is essential to grasping the complete picture of Ork slavery and why it represents such an absolute form of bondage. Active resistance within Ork settlements is extremely difficult for several reasons. First, slaves are worked to near exhaustion every day, leaving them with minimal energy for planning or executing resistance activities. Second, the constant presence of runthirds and Ork patrols makes secret meetings or organization nearly impossible. Third, the Orks maintain an atmosphere of suspicion and competition among slaves, making it difficult to know who can be trusted with information about potential resistance plans. Despite these obstacles, resistance does occur, typically in small, desperate actions rather than organized rebellions. A slave might sabotage equipment they are working on, causing delays or failures in Ork operations. Another might steal food or supplies and distribute them to other slaves, slightly ameliorating the constant hunger and deprivation. Some attempt to help injured or sick fellow slaves, providing comfort and basic care when the Orks provide none. These small acts of resistance rarely have any significant impact on Ork operations, but they serve an important psychological function. They are assertions of agency, proof that the slaves are not completely powerless, that some choices still remain even in the depths of captivity. For the individuals involved, these actions can provide a sense of purpose and dignity that helps maintain sanity in an insane situation. The consequences for resistance when discovered are severe. The Orks respond to any act of defiance with brutal and disproportionate violence, not just to punish the specific individual, but to terrorize the entire slave population into compliance. A slave caught sabotaging equipment might be publicly tortured to death over the course of hours or days, their screams serving as a warning to others. A theft of food might result in the execution of an entire work gang, making an example that deters future attempts. Escape attempts are more common than organized resistance, driven by the desperate hope that freedom might somehow be achievable, despite all evidence to the contrary. Slaves plan their escapes during rare moments of privacy, hoarding whatever supplies they can secretly gather, studying the patterns of patrols and guard rotations, looking for any weakness in the security that keeps them confined. The practical obstacles to escape are numerous and severe. Most Ork settlements are located in hostile environments, where survival without proper equipment and supplies is nearly impossible. The worlds may have toxic atmospheres, extreme temperatures, dangerous wildlife, or other environmental hazards that make wilderness survival a death sentence. Even on more hospitable worlds, the lack of food, water, and shelter quickly becomes fatal to escaped slaves whose bodies are already weakened by months or years of hard labor and poor nutrition. The Orks themselves represent the most significant obstacle to escape. Runthered patrols, with their squighounds, cover the areas around slave quarters and work sites. The squighounds are trained trackers, capable of following human scent across long distances. Once they pick up the trail of an escapee, they pursue relentlessly until they catch and kill their prey. Ork boys also patrol the perimeters of settlements and work sites, and while they may not be as systematic as Runthered patrols, they are far more dangerous if encountered. An Ork who discovers an escaping slave will typically kill them on the spot, either with weapons or bare hands. Some Orks find the hunt entertaining and will deliberately allow escapees a head start before pursuing them for sport. The few slaves who manage to evade immediate capture face the problem of where to go. On Ork-held worlds, there are no friendly settlements where a human might find sanctuary. The entire planet is hostile territory, and any Orks encountered will either kill you or return you to slavery. On worlds not fully conquered by Orks, feral Ork tribes proliferate in wilderness areas, making those regions equally dangerous. Even if a slave could somehow reach Imperial-held territory, which would require crossing vast distances through hostile terrain, they would likely be treated with suspicion by Imperial authorities. Long-term exposure to Ork captivity might lead to quarantine or even execution, as the Imperium fears potential corruption or contamination from prolonged contact with Xenos. The harsh reality is that escaped slaves often face persecution even from their own people. The most famous example of successful slave resistance occurred when Commissar Sebastian Yarrick was captured by Gazgukul Thraka after the Battle of Golgotha. Yarrick endured grueling torture and forced labor aboard Gazgukul's Space Hulk before leading a slave revolt that allowed him and other captives to escape. This event is nearly unique in the annals of Ork slavery, remarkable precisely because it is so unusual for any slave to successfully resist Ork captivity, let alone a figure as prominent as Yarrick. Yarrick's success can be attributed to several exceptional factors: his personal combat prowess, his understanding of orc psychology from years of fighting them, his natural leadership abilities, and the peculiar respect that Gazkul himself had developed for the commissar. These circumstances were so unusual that they cannot reasonably be replicated by ordinary slaves, making Yarrick's escape more of an exception that proves the rule than a model that others might follow. More commonly, resistance and escape attempts end in failure and death. The Orks ensure that these failures are public and horrific, using them as opportunities to reinforce the futility of resistance among the broader slave population. Public executions of escaped slaves are common, conducted with maximum cruelty to create a spectacle that terrorizes other captives into compliance. The psychological impact of witnessing failed escapes is devastating. Each attempt that ends in the escapee's brutal death reinforces the sense of hopelessness that pervades slave populations. It demonstrates that even the bravest and most resourceful individuals cannot overcome the barriers to freedom, that the cage is simply too strong to break. This accumulation of failed attempts can crush the morale of entire work gangs, leaving them resigned to their fate. Some slaves choose a different form of escape: suicide. When the pain and degradation become unbearable, when there seems to be no prospect of anything ever improving, some slaves deliberately end their own lives. Methods vary depending on what opportunities present themselves: stepping in front of dangerous machinery, provoking an orc into killing them, refusing to eat until starvation takes them, or finding some other means to achieve death. The orcs generally do not care if slaves commit suicide, viewing it as simply one more form of weakness that culls the unsuitable from their labor force. They make no particular effort to prevent suicide beyond the practical concern that too many deaths might reduce the workforce below functional levels. In some cases, orcs find slave suicide amusing, particularly if the method chosen is dramatic or painful. The question of whether resistance is worthwhile, given its near-certain failure and terrible consequences, haunts many slaves. On one hand, resistance maintains dignity and agency, providing psychological benefits that can be crucial to maintaining sanity. On the other hand, it invites brutal retaliation that might kill not just the resistor, but other innocent slaves as well. The ethical calculus is impossibly complex, with no clear right answer. Variations. Different orc clans and their slave treatment. The experience of orc slavery can vary significantly depending on which orc clan holds you captive. While all orc clans share fundamental characteristics and behaviors, each clan has its own cultural identity and priorities that influence how they treat their slaves. The Goths are the largest and most aggressive clan, representing the Orky ideal in its purest form. Goths are loud, violent, and obsessed with close combat and physical prowess. For slaves, being held by Goths generally means being subjected to particularly brutal treatment, as these orcs have the least patience for anything they perceive as weakness. Goth slaves are often used as sparring partners or practice targets, forced into fights with each other or with other creatures purely for orc entertainment. The Bad Moons are the richest orc clan, obsessed with accumulating wealth and displaying it ostentatiously. They have more teeth, the orc currency, than any other clan, which means they can afford to maintain larger slave populations and more extensive operations. Bad Moon slaves might find themselves working in more organized operations than those under other clans, as the Bad Moon's relative wealth allows, for slightly more systematic exploitation. However, this organization does not translate to better treatment, merely more efficient extraction of labor. Blood axes are the most willing to learn from other species and adopt their tactics. They are viewed with suspicion by other orcs because they will even work as mercenaries for non-orcs, though they typically betray their employers eventually. Blood axe slaves might encounter slightly more predictable treatment patterns, as these orcs have adopted some aspects of military discipline and organization from observing human armies. However, they are still fundamentally orcs, and their treatment of slaves remains brutal by any civilized standard. Death Skulls believe that blue brings luck and are known for looting and stealing from everyone, including other orcs. They are the most likely to scavenge and repurpose everything they can find, which extends to their use of slaves. Death Skull slaves often work in salvage operations, picking through battlefields and ruins for anything that might be valuable. The work is dangerous, as unexploded ordnance and unstable structures are common in such environments, but it can sometimes offer brief moments of relative freedom as slaves spread out across salvage sites. Evil Sons are obsessed with speed and vehicles, believing that red makes everything go faster. They favor massive numbers of bikes, buggies, and other fast-moving transports. Slaves under Evil Sons might find themselves working primarily in vehicle maintenance and manufacturing, or they might be used as pit crews for orc races. The fast-paced and chaotic nature of Evil Sons culture means that accidents are particularly common, with slaves regularly crushed by vehicles or caught in crashes. Snakebites are the most traditionalist orc clan, rejecting much of the technology that other clans embrace. They prefer beast riding and primitive weapons over guns and vehicles. Slaves under snakebite control might be assigned to care for the various creatures the clan breeds and trains for war, including massive squiggoths and other dangerous beasts. This work carries its own unique risks, as the creatures are unpredictable and often view slaves as potential prey. Freebooters are not technically a clan, but rather a collection of orc pirates and mercenaries who have been exiled or who chose to leave their original clans. They are fleet-based, using ships to traverse the galaxy and engage in piracy and raiding. The freebooter captain, known as Uzgul the Magnificent, has expressed preferences in slave species, favoring Eldar over humans because Eldar typically survive longer and have hidden reserves of strength for forced labor. Uzgul holds the spirit stones of Eldar slaves hostage as leverage to ensure compliance, demonstrating the calculating cruelty that some freebooters employ. The variation in treatment between clans should not be overstated. All orc clans fundamentally view slaves as disposable resources to be exploited until death. The differences are matters of degree and focus rather than fundamental approach. A slave under bad moons might have slightly more predictable working conditions than one under Goths, but both will experience brutal treatment, constant danger, and eventual death as the most likely outcome. Location also affects the slave experience beyond just which clan is in control. Slaves on Orc space hulks face unique challenges. Space hulks are massive conglomerations of ships that have been fused together by warp energies, creating unstable and dangerous environments. Atmospheric integrity is often compromised. Radiation leaks are common, and the twisted geometry of the fused ships creates countless hazards. Slaves working aboard space hulks must navigate these dangers while performing their assigned tasks. Slaves on orc-controlled planets face different challenges depending on the world's characteristics. On hive worlds or urban centers, slaves might work in factories and industrial centers. On agricultural worlds, they toil in fields. On mining worlds, they descend into the depths of the earth to extract resources. Each environment presents its own specific dangers and hardships. The scale of the orc settlement also matters. Small orc encampments might have only a few dozen or hundred slaves, all pressed into whatever labor is needed with minimal organization. Large orc empires, like the one created by the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, employ millions of slaves across multiple worlds, with relatively sophisticated systems for managing and deploying this labor force. During major WH40K campaigns, when orc populations reach critical mass and launch massive interstellar migrations, entire native planetary populations are forced into slavery merely to manufacture ammunition for the Horde's guns. The scale of these operations is staggering, with billions of humans potentially enslaved across dozens or hundreds of worlds, all feeding the insatiable appetite of the orc war machine. Historical examples and known cases. Throughout the long and violent history of Imperial orc conflict, numerous well-documented instances of Ork slavery have been recorded. These cases provide concrete examples of the general patterns and practices described throughout this examination, giving faces and names to what might otherwise remain abstract horrors. The Second War for Armageddon provides one of the most thoroughly documented examples of Ork enslavement of human populations. When warlord Ghazghkull Thraka's forces overwhelmed Hive in Furness in 941, the subsequent surrender delivered hundreds of thousands of humans directly into Ork captivity. The refugee columns that stretched across Armageddon's desert wastelands, harried by speed-freak biker units, represented one of the largest forced migrations of the modern imperial era. These refugees were driven back to Hive in Furness to work as slaves in the Ork war machine, the Worm. Industrial capacity of the Hive was turned toward producing munitions, weapons, and supplies for Ghazghkull's continuing campaign. Human slaves operated the foundries, assembled the weapons, and loaded the ammunition that would be used against their own people in the defense of Hades' Hive and other imperial strongholds. The psychological torture of being forced to aid in your own civilization's destruction added another layer to the physical suffering of slavery. Commissar Yarrick's own capture and enslavement aboard Ghazghkull's Space Hulk 3 years after the Second War demonstrates that even the most formidable imperial heroes are not immune to the horrors of Ork captivity. After his defeat at Golgotha in 944, Yarrick endured grueling torture and forced labor alongside other captured humans. His eventual leadership of a slave revolt and escape represents an extraordinary achievement that has entered into imperial legend, but it also illustrates just how exceptional such outcomes are. The planet Letum in the Calixis sector provides a more recent example of Ork slave practices. Following its conquest by Wa'arg Grimtuf, the entire surviving population of this temperate, fertile world was forced into slavery. Work camps were established in the planet's fields, mines, and foundries. Human labor now fuels the Ork war machine, with every crop harvested and every mineral extracted going towards sustaining the Wa'arg's ongoing expansion. The surviving population of Letum endures a daily regime of forced labor and surveillance. Slaves are herded from pens to labor sites and back again under threat of violence or execution. Constant supervision by Ork forces and their underlings prevents any organized resistance or communication beyond the planet. The complete isolation of these slaves, cut off from imperial contact or hope of rescue, represents a common pattern in Ork-held territories. The War of the Beast, in the 32nd Millennium, represents perhaps the largest and most organized example of Ork slavery in recorded history. The Ork Empire created during this period achieved a level of sophistication unprecedented before or since. On the planet Prax, imperial forces discovered extensive evidence of industrial-scale human slavery and livestock production. The Orks on Prax had been evolving faster than anticipated, developing their own society with specialists and organization. They actively conquered and enslaved humans, feeding them steroids and farming them like cattle. Some were kept as breeding stock, modified until they were barely recognizable as human. Others had their teeth punched out, were shaved and branded, then pushed into battle as auxiliary cannon fodder. The scale and systematic nature of these operations shocked even hardened imperial forces used to the horrors of war. The war boss, Hruk Teef Splinter of the Snakebites clan, provides another notable example. Hruk enslaved the entire population of the binary, System Corva, his old stomping grounds. He forced his captives to build him spacecraft with holds cavernous enough to accommodate his beloved mega menagerie of creatures. This represents a case where slave labor was employed for a specific, large-scale construction project at the whim of an individual war boss. Throughout the Armageddon conflicts, smaller-scale enslavements occurred constantly. Thousands of Imperial citizens who attempted to flee advancing Ork forces were captured by speed cults. the fast attack units that circle hive cities like buzzards waiting for prey. These captives were distributed among various Ork mobs for use in different capacities, from mine workers to factory laborers to personal servants for Ork nobs. The freebooter Uzgul the Magnificent's admitted preference for Eldar slaves over human ones provides insight into how some Orks think about the relative value of different species as labor sources. Uzgul notes that humans typically survive for only a short time and need to be replaced frequently, while Eldar slaves have a greater will to live and hidden strength for forced labor work. His practice of holding Eldar spirit stones hostage as leverage demonstrates a level of psychological manipulation unusual among Orks, but not unique. Lesser-known cases exist throughout Imperial records, brief mentions in military reports or administrative documents that hint at the broader scope of Ork slavery. References to liberated slaves found in reclaimed territories, their minds and bodies shattered by their experiences. Reports of work camps discovered and destroyed during Imperial offensives, the emaciated survivors barely recognizable as human. Accounts from interrogations of captured Orks that casually mention slaves as just another resource they manage alongside ammunition and fuel. These historical examples collectively paint a picture of slavery as a fundamental and enduring aspect of Ork civilization. It is not an aberration or an occasional practice, but rather a core component of how Orks organize their societies and conduct their wars. Wherever Orks conquer, slavery follows, as inevitable as the spores they release and the violence they perpetuate. Conclusion: to be enslaved by Orks in the grim darkness of the far future is to experience a form of suffering that challenges the limits of human endurance and comprehension. It is a descent into a hell where every day brings fresh horrors, where survival is measured in hours rather than weeks, and where death, when it finally comes, is often welcomed as a mercy. The physical torments are immense, the back-breaking labor that continues until your body fails, the constant beatings and casual violence, the inadequate food and water, the complete lack of medical care or basic sanitation. Your body accumulates damage faster than it can heal, slowly breaking down under the relentless strain until some critical system fails and you die. Another statistic in the endless churn of Ork slavery. But perhaps even worse than the physical suffering is the psychological torture. The complete erasure of your identity and dignity, the reduction of your existence to nothing more than a resource to be exploited and discarded. The constant witnessing of atrocity, the accumulation of trauma that no human mind was designed to process. The crushing despair that comes from understanding that rescue will not arrive, that escape is impossible, that this nightmare is your life now until death finally releases you. The arbitrary nature of Ork violence, the complete absence of rules or patterns you might use to protect yourself, creates an environment where psychological defense mechanisms break down. You can do everything right and still die randomly because an Ork happened to walk past in a bad mood. You can survive for months through skill and luck, only to be selected for consumption or gladiatorial combat for reasons beyond your understanding or control. The variations between Ork clans and locations provide different flavors of misery, but no real escape from the fundamental horror. Whether you are worked to death in a mine, processed as livestock, or forced to build weapons that will be used against your own people, the end result is the same. You suffer, you die, and the Orks move on to the next conquest, the next harvest of slaves, the endless cycle continuing without pause or mercy. Yet even in this darkest corner of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, some slaves maintain their humanity. They perform small acts of kindness, help their fellow captives when they can, whisper prayers to the Emperor, and refuse to let the Orks completely destroy the core of who they are. These acts of resistance, however small, represent the indomitable nature of the human spirit, the refusal to be completely broken, even when every force is aligned toward that end. The stories of Ork slavery serve as a reminder of what the Imperium fights against, why the endless wars and terrible sacrifices are deemed necessary by those who govern humanity. The Orks are not enemies who might be reasoned with or negotiated with. They are a fundamental threat to human existence, a species whose very nature demands that they conquer, enslave, and destroy everything in their path. For the billions of Imperial citizens who will never face Ork captivity, understanding these horrors provides context for the constant vigilance and military preparedness that the Imperium demands. Better to die fighting than to live as a slave. Better to endure the hardships of Imperial service than to experience the incomparable suffering that awaits those who fall into Ork hands. And for those reading this who might someday face the possibility of capture by Orks, the message is clear. Resist with every fiber of your being, fight to the last breath, and if capture seems inevitable, consider that a quick death in battle might be preferable to the prolonged torment that awaits in Ork captivity. The Imperium does not judge those who make such choices, understanding that there are fates worse than death, and that Ork slavery represents one of the absolute worst fates imaginable in a galaxy full of horrors. The Emperor protects, they say, but sometimes his protection comes in the form of a quick death rather than deliverance from captivity. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, sometimes the greatest mercy is to be granted release from suffering rather than to endure it without end. If you found this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's darkest topics informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on future lore explorations as we continue to examine the grim darkness of the far future. The Emperor protects,